Good evening and welcome to tonight's special meeting of the Board of Education. This meeting is called to order at 6 p.m. Roll call, please.
Ms. Armstrong,
Present.
Dr. Alhesson,
Here.
Mrs. Garza,
Here.
Ms. Stewart,
Present.
Mr. Critchfield.
Here. Tonight we do have one request to address the board. May I have Christina Williams to the podium, please?
Good evening, board members, Superintendent Ms. Azevedo. I'm actually speaking tonight, not just as a teacher at Mayfair, but as a community member of Bellflower. And so I just had a couple questions. I was reading about the trustee maps. I understand why you guys are moving towards this, but I do have a couple of questions and concerns. One of my questions is, what happens if nobody runs from one of the areas? I'm just wondering, how do we fill that spot? Does it come from another area? Do we just have an empty seat? Because I am concerned because a lot of times we don't have a lot of people running for office for our school board. A concern that I have is, well, I do understand that we want more representation from our community. I feel like it does limit our choices because you might have only one person running from one of the areas. They're going to automatically be in whether they are well qualified for that position or not. So that does concern me as far as them making decisions. And then my second concern is that now, instead of me having some input on 5 people that are representing the students in my community, I now only have a say in one of those people where all 5 of you are still making the decisions. So those are just things that I'm thinking about. I'm not sure if those are things that you guys have thought about and if it's maybe something that you're going to share about later on. So that way, you know, we feel a little bit more comfortable. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Do we have any corrections to the agenda this evening?
We do not.
All right, at this time, I'd like to call Custodial Supervisor Mr. Kevin Mays to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Okay, please stand. Right hand over your heart. Ready to begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, it is now time for public hearing on agenda item 4.1, composition of maps for the Board of Education by trustee area elections. We have a presentation this evening related to the item by Dr. Justin Levitt from NDC. Please begin.
Thank you, President Critchfield, and members of the board and members of the community who are here tonight to learn about this topic. My name is Dr. Justin Levitt with National Demographics. And I'll just start by kind of saying a lot of what we see in tonight's presentation will be identical to last night, that is as required by state law. So it's another opportunity to ask questions or answer concerns. And I can address the community members' concerns as part of this presentation tonight. So just to give a brief overview of what the district is doing and why, and I think that's generally the biggest questions we start with. The district is looking at moving from an at-large system where we elect all members of the board from all members of the community. Board members can live anywhere within the district. All members of the district can vote for members of the board. To a by-district or by-trustee area system where the district is broken up into 5 trustee areas. Each trustee area will have 1 trustee who must reside within the area, and only the residents within that area get to select that trustee. If there is a vacancy, that would have to be filled from that particular trustee area once that trustee area is in place. Now, vacancies would be filled the same way that a vacancy would be filled now, with the limitation that that vacancy must be filled by a resident of that particular trustee area. So there could be a special election, it could be an appointment by the board, but they would have to reside within that area of the district that holds that vacancy. So the reason why the district, and I'll just mention here, this is not about attendance areas, school assignments, or really about the responsibility of the board to all residents of the district. Really what this is just about is how we elect members to the board. And the reason why the district is looking at doing this is because of a law, state law called the California Voting Rights Act. This was a law that was passed back in 2001 that was specifically written to encourage district elections. And, essentially what it says is that jurisdictions that use other systems other than district elections are vulnerable to claims that there's racially polarized voting. Compared to the federal standards for proving racially polarized voting, state standards are actually much weaker or much less strict than federal law. In federal law, you have to go into court with evidence of statements made by people in the community, candidates for office. You have to go in with a history of intention to discriminate. And the records for these federal cases are very extensive and long. And simply having at-large elections is not proof in and of itself in federal law that you might be violating the Federal Voting Rights Act. The California Voting Rights Act was deliberately written to make these standards easier to prove, essentially reducing it to a math formula. Do members of different communities, particularly protected class communities, which the law defines groups that have historically faced discrimination or barriers to registration and voting, do they vote differently than other groups? Even two protected class communities, do they vote differently in elections? And the plaintiffs are people who want to bring a challenge, can pick and choose which elections they want to bring forth as their evidence. And essentially liability is only determined by that mathematical equation of whether people vote differently based on race, ethnicity, or protected class status. Essentially, even if we know it's other factors, even if we know that there's things like partisanship or differences between different parts of the district on an issue, as long as you could mathematically show it, you would be potentially liable. And this has resulted in a massive change. Both Lakewood and Bellflower have switched from at-large to district elections because of the California Voting Rights Act. Neighboring school districts, including ABC Unified, Los Alamitos, Anaheim High, and all of the elementary school districts within the Anaheim High School District, are just among many of those who have switched from at-large to district or trustee area elections. This now includes about 200 cities statewide. It includes over 250 school districts, community college districts. I say not Cerritos College not Cerritos or Cypress because they already had trustee areas before the law, but other districts, other community college districts around the state that were still at large have all switched now. Every single community college district is now by trustee area. And this is really because if you see on that right-hand column, some of the settlement amounts that basically districts, cities, and other local agencies were on the hook for. Many of these settlements went well into the 7 digits, and to date, not a single jurisdiction has won a case against the California Voting Rights Act. The closest a city has ever come is the city of Santa Monica. That has actually spent now over 20 million, they've spent over 10 million. And they won on appeal. They went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, we can't tell whether the city actually won or lost. We need the lower court to make some determinations on what the threshold for discrimination should be. And so that lawsuit is actually now continuing. The plaintiff there has asked for over $20 million in legal fees. And since we know that the city's public information has spent themselves over $10 million on this suit, these are some big amounts of money that particularly for school districts come right out of the classroom. And so this is not, I would say that the California Voting Rights Act is not something a lot of local jurisdictions have chosen voluntarily to say we need trustee areas to solve a particular problem or that they would benefit our community. But it certainly seems to be the intent of the legislature to make it more of a standard or default method than the traditional at-large systems that were used across the state. And that's where I'll leave it. I'm happy to answer questions about that more if you have any. And I'm happy to talk about what kind of impacts you might look at with trustee areas Although I'll say like that is something that is currently being studied because we've really seen in the last 10 years this sea change. So we really haven't seen a lot of the longer term impacts of this change to district elections. Essentially, a lot of what we know about it is based on big cities, like when San Diego adopted district elections in the 70s or San Jose in the 1980s. We don't really have a lot of cases of these smaller jurisdictions adopting district elections. And I say the concerns I heard tonight are echoed by speakers I've heard everywhere in the state. I think somebody at Rockland Elementary or Unified School District, where I was at last Thursday, made the exact same comment about what happens if there's a vacancy and we get somebody coming in from out of the district who just wants to run for that election. And it certainly is a fear I've heard time and time again. So I wish I had an easy answer for you on that question, but I think that is a real challenge posed by district or trustee area elections. Nevertheless, the state has actually laid out a formal process for making this transition under the California Voting Rights Act. This process involves 2 public hearings. Tonight's the second of these 2. To introduce the topic, to educate and inform, and to provide information about the criteria and standards used for drawing districts. At these 2 hearings, we don't have draft maps. We're not allowed to have any draft maps, and we're not allowed to discuss particular maps. That will actually start at the next hearing. So next week, on the 18th, we will have draft maps out, probably at least 3 options, so we can see what some different layouts might look like. Following that, we'll have 2 hearings on the draft maps. And those are to discuss the actual maps themselves, make changes and adjustments as needed, and to arrive at a final map at the 5th public hearing on May 23rd. Following that hearing, the whole process, the change to trustee areas, has to be approved by the County Committee on School District Organization, and that meeting will take place probably in mid-June. They do hold the hearing here in the district, so we'll have an evening hearing in the district, probably in the boardroom. And we're working with district staff on making sure County Committee is aware and getting the dates and times of that. We'll be sure to have that publicly available once we get that. This is also that we can have that first 2 seats up for election this November in 2024. The remaining 3 seats will hold their first election in 2026. Just to make it clear, any board members that were elected in 2022 continue to serve through 2026, regardless of whether or not they live in an area that's up for election or not. Essentially, this transition doesn't affect individual terms. So, this will be something we can talk a little bit more easily about once we have some maps to look at, or once we have a final map to look at. But it is kind of a rollout over the next 2 election cycles. Lastly, I'll say that in 2030, once we get the new census data, the district will have to go through a redistricting. And that's basically first just an evaluation of the current district lines that are adopted to make sure that, see whether or not they're within the population bounds and whether or not we need to make any changes to those trustee area boundaries. Just to give some examples, many of our local cities went through the process. They had the full number of hearings and didn't make any changes. Because if they meet the current criteria, as the City of Bellflower's City Council districts did, then we can readopt the same boundaries. If there are shifts in the population, that's why the law requires us to look at that and see if we need to redraw the boundaries. So when I talk about these criteria, I kind of hinted at a couple of them. Let's talk about them more explicitly. I divide these criteria up into these columns, kind of based on where they originate. The left-hand column, federal laws. These are requirements that the Supreme Court and other federal courts require of all jurisdictions that use districts, trustee areas, or any kinds of zones. And first and foremost is equal population. This is the 1 person, 1 vote principle, essentially stating that you have to use the census data to make sure that our districts have more or less the same number of total residents Again, this includes children, this includes people not registered to vote, it includes everybody counted as part of that census count. We don't have to get perfectly down to zero difference between districts or trustee areas. We're allowed up to a 10% deviation or difference in 10% between the largest and smallest districts. Secondly, after equal population, we have the Federal Voting Rights Act. We're going to look at this with some of our maps later, but essentially we have to see whether or not there are concentrations of those protected class communities, and if so, are they sufficiently compact, and do they have communities that we can identify to keep together in the same district? Race cannot be the only factor or the predominant factor in the creation of a trustee area district, but if there is a really, it's really important to be able to see what is not only feasible, but see whether or not majority districts of protected class communities make sense. And so, for example, here in Bellflower, we're going to see majority Latino districts because no matter how we draw the lines, you will get somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 majority Latino districts. Second column, we have our Fair Maps Act criteria, and these are rank ordered in terms of priority. First here is contiguity. That's a really fancy way of saying that all parts of the district have to touch each other or have one exterior boundary. You can't take a little pocket around downtown Bellflower, the portion in Cerritos, and then a corner in the southwest and say, oh, what's one district? They all have to be physically adjacent or next to each other. Below that, avoid division of neighborhoods and communities of interest. The idea is we need to keep together socioeconomic and geographic areas that need to be kept together for the purpose of their effective and fair representation. What these communities are is something that is part of this conversation. We need to be able to, or try to define, what are some of these neighborhoods and communities we're aiming to keep together throughout the district. Third, avoiding division of cities and census-designated places. We have 3 cities that make up portions of the district. About most of our districts in the city of Bellflower. About 20% of the district's population is in the city of Lakewood, and about 5% in Cerritos. And so to the extent that we need to be able to keep as much of Lakewood together as possible, and we need to keep Cerritos together, that's something that this criteria would prioritize. And that actually areas that are within Bellflower are as much within the city of Bellflower as possible. Fourth, easily identifiable boundaries. This is the principle that when we have a choice between jogging through a neighborhood or using a major street or another natural or man-made feature that serves as a real division line, we need to use those bigger division lines. Sometimes those are physical boundaries, like anything from a canal to a major road or a freeway. Sometimes they're political boundaries, like where our cities intersect with the district, within the district. And then lastly, compactness. And the law defines compactness as not bypassing one group of people to get to a more distant group of people. This is aimed at hooks and fingers, other weird geography that looks like it's aimed at getting a particular neighborhood or house into a district or trustee area. These are rank ordered, so if that is the natural division because that's the way the city boundary looks or that's the way the neighborhood is actually built out or designed, that's what we have to do first before we worry about compactness. Finally, the Fair Maps Act also has a prohibition that districts cannot be drawn for the purpose of furthering or discriminating against a political party, an incumbent, or a potential political candidate. And so what this means is that we have to draw the districts blind to those factors. We can't consider them. They can't be a reason for or against the particular selection of a map. And then at the bottom there, we have other traditional districting principles. These would be things that courts have recognized as being valid to consider, and we can consider them as sort of the final choice between 2 maps. I use school locations as a great example of this. If we have 2 maps we think do an equally good job of everything else on this list, but one of them has a more equitable division of school sites, that could be a valid reason to make that the final map you select. It's not something we can prioritize over something like contiguity or keeping neighborhoods together, but that could be the final test between two different maps we think do a really good job. So what does this all look like when we talk about numbers? Well, the census found 84,200 residents, just shy of 84,200 residents within Bellflower Unified. That's the number we're going to divide by 5 to get our ideal population. In other words, each of those trustee areas will have a fifth of that population. In addition, we also have to we also are looking at some of our statistics or racial numbers for the purposes of the Voting Rights Act. And for that, we use the second box, the citizen voting age population box, because that's the population over 18 with U.S. citizenship that the courts look at as the eligible voter numbers. Either way, we don't actually see huge differences between total and citizen voting age population here in the district. In many jurisdictions, the differences are much wider. The district overall is about half Latino, both by total population and by eligible voters. There's a small difference, most likely reflecting that the Latino community tends to be younger than the community as a whole. We're going to look at those numbers in more detail in the following slides, so I'll come back to those numbers later. I just want to mention that we do have a lot of other demographic data available, and on the interactive web viewer, one of our tools, we have maps where you can view a lot of these measures like renters and owners, single and multifamily housing, income, education, and so forth. If these are very standard measures that we use in all of our projects, if there are ones that come up that we need to look at specifically for Bellflower Unified, we can certainly add to this list as well. When we do our maps, each map will have a demographics spreadsheet attached to it that gives a breakdown of many of these measures across all the different trustee areas in each map. So looking at our racial demographics for the Voting Rights Act, we look at that eligible voter breakdown block by block, and here we're using census blocks. Census blocks are the smallest unit of census geography that they capture numbers at. And when they go household by household, they don't actually report each individual household. They report it within the literal square block or rectangular block you live in. And so these are the units that we're going to be building up into our trustee areas. Now, the way the coloring works, the areas that are in yellow and pink are over 65 or 75% Latino respectively. The areas in the lighter blue and purple blue, those are under 35 and 25% Latino respectively. And so what we can see is that Latinos make up a majority of the population in the city of Bellflower, particularly on the western and northern sides of Bellflower, north of the 91 freeway in particular. We also look at this for the Asian American and African American community. You see, we don't have nearly as much area that has a majority Asian or majority African American population. We do see some concentrations of Asian Americans in the southeastern portion of the city, in Cerritos and southeast Lakewood. And we see a lot of the African American population, some slight concentrations around the freeway, around the 91 freeway. And so these are some areas that may not be at the level of federal voting rights concerns, but they still are very big concerns when we talk about communities and neighborhoods. And that brings us right into defining neighborhoods. And the way that we really think about defining what a neighborhood is this idea that a neighborhood has some sort of thing that is shared among people who reside close to each other. And I really want to emphasize the physical boundaries of these neighborhoods because we're drawing districts on the ground. And so if we can figure out what some factors are that unite people together with their shared issues, shared problems, shared need for a common representative, we want to do that. We often look at those demographic numbers, and that can certainly tell us something about the population, But obviously that can't tell us that can't be a substitute for your local knowledge and the community's local knowledge of where differences or where divisions are on the ground. Attendance areas or school boundaries are often one that's very common, especially elementary school boundaries in school districts. But it's certainly not the only one. And, many jurisdictions have their own unique communities of interest that we want to make sure to account for. So just to give you some highlights, we do have some information on our line. As you can view these online at our interactive web viewer, looking at where we see renters and owners on the left, where we see children at home. And just to show you kind of some of the differences, renters are very much clustered, for example, in Central Bellflower. And as we kind of get south and, outside of Central Bellflower, the percentage of people who rent goes down. But when we look at children at home, it's kind of more of a patchwork. And the area with the lowest percentage of families with children at home is right next to the area with the highest percentage of families with children at home. So these are the kinds of things that we might want to look at. But we have to then interpret that and try to understand what it means for our district. In addition to the review tool that I've already mentioned, we have another tool that I also want to talk about briefly. First of all, our ArcGIS online tool. This is the one you'll go to where you can view the demographic data. There is a box on the right-hand side that lists all the different layers of data. As we add our draft maps, they'll go right onto this tool as well. So you can look at those draft map lines right over all the demographic data if you choose to do so. We also have a drawing tool that allows you to sort of paint the trust districts as you want them to. This tool, basically you sign up for an account. The template is linked on our district website. And what you can do is you can literally go in block by block and paint each block with the district you'd like to assign it to or trustee area you'd like to assign it to. Anytime you finish a map on this particular tool, simply copy the URL and email it in, and we will draw in your submission. If you draw a partial map or single trustee area or 2 trustee areas, however much you want, all the way up to a full map, we'll draw anything in. It also lets you share that URL. So if you want to collaborate or work with other people, you could also share that. You can also do that on this tool as well. And I should also mention, for that tool, we do have guides, including both a PowerPoint presentation that step by step, as well as 2 videos, a short video and a long video that walk you through using the tool. And so that brings me to the end of the presentation. Tonight, we're really focused on answering your questions about the process, about communities of interest, and whatever we need to do so we can go back and draw the best districts we can. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that presentation. And at this time, I'll declare the public hearing open. Is there anybody from the public who would like to speak on the item? No? Questions from the board? Ms. Garza.
Thank you, President Critchfield. My question is there a specific number of maps one person from the community can submit?
So the answer is no. We would certainly encourage you to kind of, if you're going to submit multiple maps, let us know which map you are most interested in or which one you think does the best job. I always hope that any map we get will be a productive part of the conversation. And so the more you can explain you're submitting a map and putting in the detail that tells us about those communities of interest and neighborhoods you're representing, the better. But we certainly will draw in anything we receive.
Thank you, Ms. Garza. Dr. Alhassan.
Yes, I was wondering, on the June 2024 county committee hearing, are they going to finalize the decision of that map then that night? Or is there a waiting period where they go back and deliberate? I just was wondering the process there.
Sure. So typically, every county committee is a little different. What LA County Committee typically does is they hold the hearing in the district, and they don't take any action at that point. And at their next regular board meeting, they handle all of the requests to transition to trustee areas kind of at the same time, first thing in the hearing, where they do an approval of them.
Do you know when that is for this committee, or you don't?
Well, I can definitely, I don't know exactly, but I can definitely find out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we can definitely find that out.
Thank you, Dr. Sue. Ms. Stewart.
Okay, I have kind of a long question. It's a few pieces, but it's all one. So I'm a community member. I want to go draw this map. So what I'm asking is if you could possibly give me some advice. Like my question is, would I focus on the 16,000 to the 17,000 in each group? Can you have more in one area than other a little bit? I know, like you said, Bellflower is about 75%, Lakewood's about 20, and then Cerritos is 25. So thinking 25, could it be feasible to break that 25 up into 2 and the other in 3? Like, if a community member is going to draw a map, what would be my focus?
Sure. Sure. And I think, one of the reasons why we have our slide put together this way is because we want to walk through it from the beginning to the end. Our first priority is making sure that districts have the same number of residents, trustee areas. So our number, 16,840 approximately. That's the first goal. If we're more than about, if we're below, say, if we have trustee areas in the range of, and I'm just kind of doing some quick mental math here, 16,000 to about 17,300, or give or take, 17,400, we're probably fine. But if we have larger or smaller than that, then we're going to run into that 10% deviation. On the tool, you can actually see the deviations for each trustee area. So the tool has a feature that you can view that. So you'll be able to tell whether or not that's too many people or too few residents. Secondly, I don't want to overemphasize, because it's actually not okay in the Voting Rights Act to simply put up this map and say, I'm going to draw around the Latino area. That's not, actually, the Voting Rights Act says that's not what you do. The Voting Rights Act actually says the next thing we want to worry about is, I'll go down to this middle column, neighborhoods and communities of interest. So we want to see, maybe, and this is actually probably a place where most people start, is where are the cores of each of those 5 trustee areas going to be? What neighborhood or neighborhoods are they going to include? And work from there. Work from the neighborhoods that you think need to be kept together. Is there a division line that really makes sense to you? And then we can see how many people it is.
So it is possible that there could be Lakewood, Cerritos, or some Bellflower all in one, or some of Lakewood and Bellflower. It doesn't have to be broken down into those cities particularly.
So it doesn't have to be, but and to the extent that we are following the law, those neighborhoods and communities of interest is why we would break up the cities. So we want to be able to justify those areas, especially if we're, if we're dividing, I just know from the numbers that, you can get one district in Lakewood, and Lakewood is one district. That's almost ideal population for one district. So if that's not how we want the final lines to be, we need to be able to justify that according to neighborhoods and communities of interest. How do those neighborhoods within Lakewood link to neighborhoods adjacent to Lakewood in Bellflower? And so that we want to be able to identify, oh yeah, this is the name of the community of interest here. It could be as simple as an attendance area or school boundary. Like I want to keep this elementary area together. And so therefore I'm linking and using, I don't know, Bellflower Boulevard, Lakewood Boulevard, whatever the street is, as the dividing line. And that's my justification for separating east and west Lakewood. But, because of the way the law works, we want to be able to point to that neighborhood or community of interest if we're going to be dividing a city for a particular reason.
Thank you. I'm just thinking ahead because I feel like talking with some of the Lakewood residents that having one person for their whole community, that might not be very
Yes.
great for them in their minds. That's all I'm asking.
This is just this. I mean, this has really recently come up a lot because this is a law that they took the language straight from the state. The state criteria that they use for congressional and state legislative redistricting. And you might think that in Congress or in Sacramento, it doesn't make much sense to divide the city of Lakewood into, I think it was in 3 congressional districts at one point in the 90s. So maybe that doesn't make sense. And so they put this language in there, and then they copied and pasted it for all the special districts and school districts. Especially for a lot of local jurisdictions, it may not make a lot of sense. I know one school district where we had 2 little pieces of a city that came in separately along the same edge of it. And we still had to find a way to try to keep them together because we couldn't find a community of interest reason to separate them. So that's what we're looking for, communities of interest. And I really emphasize that as the core of this whole process.
I have a question for you. Obviously, we have the criteria there in order of priority. But would it be, when it comes to our schools and the schools of residence, to superimpose that upon like one of these maps, like where the boundaries are for each schools? Because that would probably help us as well.
We can put those boundaries on the interactive review map if they're not already.
Okay.
So we can see them and you could have them. Yeah. We can
That'd be great.
work with the district to make sure we get those lines.
Thank you. Any other questions, colleagues? Ms. Stewart?
Just one question. Were we able to get this map tool on our website? It's there currently.
It is.
Thank you.
How many maps do you, with the interactive tool, do you see as a success from our community to gather? Obviously, we want to get as many voices heard as possible. How many are you expecting?
That's a hard question because there's no real fixed number. We have had cases where we've had 15 maps, but it was one individual submitting all 15 maps.
Right.
And he did everything that he could to kind of show all the different options in his mind, including 4 maps that all differed by a single block each. So it was, we don't want that. Like, that's actually not very helpful when we're looking at 4 maps that look identical on this PowerPoint screen.
Right.
But I think the map tool is not only useful as a way of submitting maps, it's a way of exploring what you can do. I know a lot of people who have even used the tool and not ended up submitting a map, but use it to understand the decisions, like the trade-offs that exist in the maps that they've seen in the 3rd or 4th public hearing. So I would say that I can't put a fixed number on it, but we hope to get maps in, and we do hope that if you do, you'll get them in maybe a day or 2 before the deadline, so that we have time to draw them in and process them, because we do have to analyze the maps before they go out publicly to standardize how they're presented and all that, and to make sure that anything we get off the web tool is meets the criteria, and to be able to tell residents that this map may look good, but it doesn't meet the criteria if it doesn't.
But the board will be able to consider those maps. We will see the maps presented from the community.
So essentially, our deadline for posting maps that we discuss at the next hearing is April 18th. There'll be another deadline of May 2nd before the hearing on May 9th. That's the state law requires we have everything available for at least a week before the hearing at which it's discussed.
And where will those maps be able to be seen at that hearing? You'll present each one of those maps?
We'll present those maps. Will be posted online, and they'll be available here at the district office.
Posted online where?
On the districting website.
Okay, so when they're done, they go directly there?
They'll be provided to us, correct?
Yes.
For posting? Yes.
Yes.
Then we'll post them.
Okay.
Yeah.
I do have one more question regarding timeline of elections. So I understand that it wouldn't change or alter anybody's current service of the board through 2026. But when it comes to upcoming elections and which districts would be up, how would that work? Because right now we go by, we'll say trustees, we have 2 that are up, but at what point do you select which areas would be up for election?
So so essentially, the final determination is made at the county committee hearing. However, each map will be posted with a sequence of elections, or which trustee areas will be up for election in which year, because we know the process that the county committee uses to make that determination. Essentially, if there is a member in a particular trustee area who would be up for election in 2026, that area will be assigned to 2026. Any remaining seats, if they have a trustee that's up in 2024, that area would be assigned to 2024, and then vacancies would be assigned as appropriate. So, if, generally speaking, like if there's 2 members that are on the same cycle that are paired in an area, that would leave a vacant trustee area somewhere else that would also be put up in the same year as those 2 paired members' terms would occur.
So so I believe I follow. So if a trustee area was up in 2024, that also had another trustee in that area as well, in 2 years, that person would not be able to run for that seat. They would have to run the following.
So if there is any 2026 member in a particular seat, that area will be up in 2026.
Right, but if there's
And
if in the
if there is a-
2024 they are also in that area that's up,
Yeah.
that means that seat wouldn't be available to them.
That's right.
Okay.
And that there would be a vacant seat somewhere else in the district
Right.
that would be assigned to 2024.
Right. Okay.
And that's simply the way the education code actually says that we do this. We have to do our best effort not to, what they say is that, we can't, it would be to impair voters if we were just to assign randomly. And so they don't assign randomly. They use this process, to fill, essentially what the county committee says is to fill the vacancies as quickly as possible. So any pairing of members on 2 years, that vacant seat that's somewhere else in the area would have to be filled first.
Right. No, it is interesting because it's you can't consider the incumbents, but you also have to in order to accomplish that goal. So it's kind of tricky, it sounds like.
They didn't modify the education code language when they passed the Fair Maps Act.
Right.
So I have to draw them blind, and I send any maps without any years on them over to the attorneys, and our attorney will figure out what that sequencing would be. And it actually, whatever you adopt, the county committee will then have the final determination on what that is. And so they will make the final approval of the sequence based on that formula.
Great. That's all my questions. Any other questions? Christina? After listening, I do have Okay. Yeah, well, we're going to right over to you. Yep.
Okay, so listening to this, it sounds like a big deal, drawing maps. And so I was just wondering, are we considering maybe inviting different stakeholders from the community to maybe work together to come up with a map? Because I feel like everybody has the perspective of where you live. I know about my pocket where I live, but I don't know about a lot of areas, a lot of other areas in our district. So I think it might be something maybe to consider because this is kind of a big deal. And then also, those release draft maps are only a week away. That seems awfully fast. And I think that we have had some instances where maybe we've moved a little too quickly on things. And sometimes you do have to go slow in order to go fast. So I don't know if these are dates that we want to, that we would consider maybe moving back because this just seems awfully full steam ahead. I don't know, like, even if I went home this weekend and started working on maps, am I going to be able to put together something good in a week when, I'm just seeing this information now, looking at all these different demographics? That's a lot to consider to get done in a week and also still have our lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Christina. Hey, I think that's one of the the purpose of having all the public hearings. I think there's going to be 4, and I do like that tool, the collaborative tool, how you can share the URL and work with people on the maps as well. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for people to come in, and I hope they do. I hope we get a lot of voices from the community with this. Yeah. Any other questions from public? Comments? No? You sure? At this time, if there's no objection, this meeting is adjourned at 6:46 p.m.
Mr. President, we have to close the public
Oh,
hearing.
that's
and then-
right. I now motion to close the public hearing. If there's no objection, the meeting is adjourned at 6:46 and a half until the board retreat to be held on Thursday, April 25th, 2024. Thank you.